The fluorescent lights of Summit Ridge high hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to Jasmine's apprehension. Each step down the brightly lit hallway felt like walking a tightrope. New school, new town, new life. Her father's promotion to Chief Whitfield had uprooted them all. She clutched her books tighter, a shield against the unfamiliar stares. A group of girls, their laughter echoing off the lockers, paused mid-giggle to assess her. Jasmine felt a prickle of unease, the feeling intensifying as a shadow fell over her. "Hey, new girl." The voice was low, laced with a casual arrogance that grated on her nerves. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Trent Dawson. His reputation had preceded him. Jasmine's stomach tightened. Ignore him, she told herself. Just keep walking. But her feet felt leaden, rooted to the spot. A nervous flutter erupted in her chest. He's just trying to get a reaction. He leaned closer, his shadow enveloping her. "I'm talking to you, Whitfield." His breath, faintly smelling of mint gum, ghosted over her ear. Jasmine's jaw clenched. She forced herself to keep moving, her pace quickening. She could hear the snickers of his friends trailing behind her like a pack of hyenas. The hallway suddenly felt suffocating. Don't engage. Don't give him the satisfaction. The subtle harassment continued for days, a relentless undercurrent of whispers and laughter that followed her through the halls. Every turn, every corner, seemed to bring her face to face with Trent and his entourage. In the cafeteria, their table was strategically positioned to observe her every move. She could feel their eyes boring into her back, dissecting her, judging her. Jasmine's appetite vanished. The food on her tray suddenly seemed tasteless, like ash in her mouth. In English class, Mr. Holloway droned on about Shakespeare, but Jasmine couldn't focus. Trent sat 2 rows behind her, his whispers a constant distraction. "I just think it's funny that you know how some people show up where they're not wanted." Jasmine's fingers tightened around her pen, the plastic digging into her skin. Her internal monologue raged. "He's trying to bait me. Don't react. Just breathe." A crumpled piece of paper landed on her desk. It was a crudely drawn caricature of her, exaggerated features, and a mocking caption. "Go back to where you came from." A wave of heat washed over Jasmine's face. Humiliation burned in her throat, threatening to spill over. Her hand trembled as she unfolded the paper, her nails digging into the creases. "Why me? What did I ever do to him?" The bell rang, releasing her from the suffocating classroom. She practically fled, her heart pounding against her ribs. In the crowded hallway, she bumped into someone, dropping her books. "Sorry," she mumbled, scrambling to gather them. A hand reached down, helping her retrieve a stray notebook. It was Liam, one of Trent's friends. He hesitated, his gaze meeting hers for a fleeting moment. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that resembled pity. He quickly looked away, melting back into the crowd. Jasmine's mind raced. Did he feel bad for her? Was there a crack in Trent's impenetrable wall of followers? The next day in the cafeteria, the tension reached its peak. Jasmine sat alone, picking at her salad, trying to ignore the palpable weight of Trent's stare. He sauntered over, his friends trailing behind him like obedient shadows. The cafeteria noise seemed to fade, replaced by the drumming of her own heart. "Mind if I join you?" Trent's voice dripped with false politeness. Jasmine didn't answer, her eyes fixed on her plate. She felt a tremor of fear run through her. This is it. He's going to do something. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm. A shiver of revulsion coursed through her. "You're not very friendly, Whitfield," he said, his voice low and menacing. Before she could react, he grabbed her tray, tilting it. The contents salad, fruit, and a carton of milk cascaded over her, soaking her clothes. The cafeteria erupted in laughter. Jasmine sat frozen, the sticky residue of the dressing clinging to her skin. Humiliation washed over her, a tidal wave of shame and anger. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She slowly lifted her head, her gaze locking onto Trent's. In that moment, something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a surge of defiance. "I will not break." A hush fell over the cafeteria. A new figure stood at the entrance, his presence commanding attention. It was Chief Whitfield, Jasmine's father. He surveyed the scene, his eyes sharp and unwavering. He walked towards them, his steps measured and deliberate. "What's going on here?" His voice, though calm, carried an undercurrent of steel. Trent stammered, his usual arrogance faltering under the weight of Chief Whitfield's gaze. "It was just a joke, sir." Chief Whitfield's eyes narrowed. "A joke? Dumping someone's lunch on them is a joke." Trent's face paled. He glanced at his friends, seeking support, but they avoided his gaze. The power dynamic had shifted. The predator had become the prey. The arrival of Chief Whitfield had a ripple effect. Miss Rees, the assistant principal, materialized at his side, followed by Principal Warren. The Dawson parents were summoned, their faces a mixture of shock and embarrassment. The incident became a spectacle, a public display of Trent's downfall. Jasmine watched it all unfold, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even angry anymore. She felt empty. The fight had been drained out of her, replaced by a hollow weariness. As her father led her away from the scene, he squeezed her hand gently. "You okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Jasmine nodded, unable to speak. The words were caught in her throat, a tangled mess of emotions she couldn't yet unravel. She knew this was just the beginning. The whispers wouldn't stop. The stares wouldn't cease. But something had changed. She had faced her fear, and in doing so, she had found a flicker of strength within herself. A strength that would help her navigate the treacherous waters of Summit Ridge High. The fluorescent lights of the Summit Ridge High cafeteria hummed, a dull counterpoint to the chaotic symphony of lunchtime. Jasmine Whitfield picked at the limp salad on her tray, the plastic fork bending precariously under the weight of a cherry tomato. Each bite felt like swallowing sawdust. Her stomach churned, but not from hunger. It was the gnawing unease that had become her constant companion since she'd started at Summit Ridge 2 weeks ago. She could feel their eyes on her, Trent Dawson and his entourage, a pack of wolves circling their prey. Just ignore them, she told herself, her internal monologue a frantic whisper. Pretend they're not there. But the pretense was thin, brittle like the lettuce leaves she pushed around her plate. She could practically smell their amusement, thick and cloying like the artificial grape scent of Trent's favorite energy drink. "Look who it is!" A voice boomed across the table, shattering the fragile peace Jasmine had constructed. It was Liam, Trent's second-in-command, his words dripping with mock concern. "Our little loner, eating all by herself again." A ripple of laughter followed. Jasmine's throat tightened. "Don't react," she thought, gripping her fork so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Don't give them the satisfaction." Trent leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He held a half-eaten sandwich in one hand, the other toying with a lock of his perfectly styled hair. He observed her with the detached amusement of a cat watching a cornered mouse. "You always eat alone, Whitfield," he drawled, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the cafeteria. "Why is that?" Jasmine remained silent, her gaze fixed on her salad. The silence seemed to amplify the tension, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. Some students looked away, embarrassed. Others watched with a morbid curiosity. She knew what they were thinking. Another victim, Kyle, another of Trent's cronies, chimed in. "I think she likes being a loner." "Right, Jasmine? You like being alone, don't you?" Jasmine's jaw clenched. The casual cruelty of his words was a sharp jab, twisting the knife of her loneliness. "They don't understand," she thought, a surge of resentment rising within her. "They don't know anything about me." But the words remained trapped in her throat, a choked cry she couldn't release. Trent rose from his chair, his shadow falling over her. He picked up her tray, his eyes glinting with malice. Jasmine looked up, a flicker of fear finally betraying her carefully constructed facade. For a moment, their gazes locked, a silent battle of wills waged in the crowded cafeteria. "Oops," Trent said, a saccharine smile spreading across his face as he flipped her tray, sending the contents cascading onto her. Salad, dressing, and diced tomatoes splattered across her shirt and the table, a sticky, humiliating mess. The cafeteria erupted in laughter. Jasmine felt a wave of heat rush to her face. Humiliation burned through her, hot and searing. But beneath the shame, a flicker of defiance ignited. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. She slowly stood up, her movements deliberate and controlled, picking up the fallen plastic fork. Methodically, she began to scrape the mess onto a napkin, her gaze unwavering. The laughter gradually subsided, replaced by a stunned silence. Trent's smile faltered. He hadn't expected this. He expected tears, a panicked retreat, the usual display of weakness he'd grown accustomed to from his victims. But Jasmine's calm defiance was unsettling, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of his power. As she turned to leave, Trent stepped into her path, blocking her escape. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice laced with a newfound edge of irritation. "Move," Jasmine said, her voice quiet but firm. The two words hung in the air, charged with an unexpected intensity. It was the first time she had directly challenged him, a small act of rebellion that resonated with a surprising force. Trent's eyebrows rose in surprise. "It was an accident," he said, his tone feigning innocence, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of anger. "Move," she repeated, her gaze unflinching. Just as Trent was about to retort, a sharp voice cut through the tense silence. "Mr. Dawson, what is the meaning of this?" Miss Rees, the assistant principal, stood at the edge of the chaos, her face a mask of disapproval. Her arrival was like a sudden downpour extinguishing a brush fire. The crowd dispersed, leaving Jasmine and Trent standing in the center of the mess, the remnants of her lunch a stark testament to the incident. Trent opened his mouth to speak, a practiced excuse forming on his lips, but before he could utter a word, another figure appeared at the edge of the scene. "Jasmine," the voice was deep and resonant, carrying an air of quiet authority that silenced the remaining murmurs in the cafeteria. It was Chief Whitfield, Jasmine's father. He stood at the entrance, his gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the spilled food, his daughter's stained shirt, and the defiant set of her jaw. He had been observing from a distance, a silent guardian waiting for the opportune moment. He had seen the escalating harassment, the deliberate cruelty, and the calculated humiliation. He had also seen his daughter's transformation, the hesitant fear replaced by a nascent strength. Trent's face paled. The bravado that had just moments ago filled the cafeteria evaporated, replaced by a nervous uncertainty. He had underestimated his new classmate. He had also, it seemed, underestimated her father. The aroma of jasmine tea, her mother's favorite, curled through the kitchen, a fragile tendril of normalcy in a day that had cracked and splintered. Jasmine sat at the kitchen table, the chipped formica cool against her forearms. She picked at a plate of untouched toast, each bite a leaden weight in her stomach. The fluorescent kitchen light buzzed faintly overhead, a relentless, irritating drone mirroring the anxiety that thrummed beneath her skin. She tried to appear absorbed in the textbook open before her, the words blurring into meaningless symbols. Her father, Elliot Whitfield, newly appointed chief of police, entered the kitchen, his presence filling the room not with intimidation, but with a quiet strength that always seemed to settle the dust of her anxieties. He moved with an economy of motion honed over years in the force, pouring himself a cup of coffee, the clink of the ceramic mug against the countertop a stark counterpoint to the silence that hung between them. He studied her for a moment, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice low, a rumble that resonated with a lifetime of carefully measured words. "Just tired," Jasmine mumbled, her gaze fixed on the textbook. She could feel his eyes on her, a silent interrogation that made her want to shrink into herself. Tired, such a small, inadequate word to encompass the churning storm within her. Fear, humiliation, a simmering anger that she didn't dare let surface. She'd rehearsed the casual dismissal countless times on the walk home, each repetition making the lie feel heavier, more suffocating. He sat down opposite her, the chair scraping lightly against the linoleum floor. The sound, normally unremarkable, grated on her nerves. "Some kid dumped my lunch on me today," she finally admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush, a dam finally giving way. She kept her eyes downcast, focusing on a stain on the tablecloth, a faded splotch of something she couldn't identify. She didn't want to see his reaction, didn't want to see the pity, the concern, the inevitable questions. A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to intensify, filling the void. She braced herself for the gentle probing, the fatherly advice. Instead, he simply said, "Trent Dawson." Jasmine's head snapped up, surprise momentarily eclipsing the other emotions warring within her. "How did you?" He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant, as if replaying a scene in his mind. "Saw his father at the station earlier today. Bragging, as usual. Seems his son is quite the influential young man at Northwood High." The subtle sarcasm in his voice didn't escape her. A bitter taste rose in Jasmine's throat. Influential. That's what they called it when someone used fear and intimidation to control others. She knew about the Dawsons. Everyone did. Trent's father, Darren Dawson, was a prominent businessman in town, his fingers in every pie, his influence extending even to the school board. It was an unspoken truth that Trent was untouchable. It's fine," she said, forcing a lightness she didn't feel. "Just a stupid prank." She wanted to believe her own words, to convince herself that it was just a minor inconvenience, a fleeting moment of embarrassment. But the shame still clung to her, a sticky residue she couldn't shake off. Her father set his mug down, the quiet clink echoing in the sudden stillness. "It does matter, Jasmine," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. He met her gaze, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that surprised her. He saw through her facade, through the carefully constructed wall of indifference she'd built around herself. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, a mixture of frustration and relief. She hated this feeling of vulnerability, of being exposed. She wanted to be strong, to handle it on her own, but the weight of it all was crushing her. "But what can I do?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He's Trent Dawson. Everyone's afraid of him, even the teachers." The memory of Mr. Holloway's averted gaze, Miss Reese's ineffectual reprimand, flashed through her mind. They were all complicit in their silence, in their unwillingness to challenge the established order. Her father reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, reassuring. "You don't have to fight this alone," he said, his voice soft but resolute. A complex interplay of emotions flickered across his face: concern, anger, a steely determination that sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't just her father in that moment. He was Chief Whitfield, a man accustomed to confronting injustice, to holding those in power accountable. Jasmine stared at him, a flicker of hope igniting within her. She had always seen him as her protector, her shield against the world. But she had never seen this side of him, this quiet, controlled fury. It was a revelation, a glimpse into the man behind the badge, the man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, to fighting for what was right. And in that moment, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that things were about to change. The fear that had been a constant companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a nascent sense of empowerment, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as powerless as she thought. The jasmine tea, unnoticed and growing cold, still perfumed the air, a subtle promise of tranquility amidst the gathering storm. The sterile, almost antiseptic scent of the principal's office pressed down on Jasmine. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to amplify the silence between the adults. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, were slick with a cold sweat she couldn't seem to shake. "Just breathe, Jasmine," she told herself. "It's almost over." But the knot in her stomach tightened with each passing second. She stole a glance at her father. Chief Whitfield sat ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on Principal Warren. There was a stillness about him, a quiet intensity that both reassured and terrified her. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene, yet the air in the room crackled with unspoken tension. Principal Warren shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, the squeak echoing in the strained quiet. He tugged at his tie, his face a mask of strained neutrality. Beside him, Miss Rees, the assistant principal, wrung her hands, her gaze darting nervously between the chief and the Dawsons. Trent sat slouched in a chair next to his parents, a sullen defiance etched on his face. He avoided Jasmine's eyes, his usual swagger replaced by a simmering resentment. He picked at a loose thread on his jeans, a nervous tick Jasmine had noticed during their previous encounters. He's scared, she realized with a flicker of something akin to satisfaction. Good. Mr. and Mrs. Dawson, however, exuded an air of indignant disbelief. Mrs. Dawson, Lauren, clutched her designer handbag, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping against the polished leather. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her eyes, usually bright and social, were narrowed, assessing the chief with an almost predatory gaze. Mr. Dawson, Darren, a large man with a booming voice that usually filled every room, sat unusually still, his face flushed a mottled red. He looked like a caged bull, ready to charge but held back by some invisible force. Jasmine knew that force. It emanated from her father, a silent pressure that filled the room. My daughter was publicly humiliated in your cafeteria. Chief Whitfield's voice was low, steady, each word meticulously enunciated. The simple statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusation. Jasmine watched as Principal Warren flinched, his carefully constructed composure cracking ever so slightly. Chief Whitfield, we understand your concern. Principal Warren began, his voice smooth, practiced. But I assure you, we're taking this matter very seriously. Seriously? Jasmine thought, the word echoing cynically in her mind. After weeks of ignoring my complaints? Taking it seriously would have prevented it from happening in the first place. Chief Whitfield's voice remained calm, but there was a steely edge to it now. My daughter reported Mr. Dawson's behavior on multiple occasions. Nothing was done. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. No excuses. Lauren Dawson bristled. Now hold on just a minute, she interjected, her voice sharp. Trent told us it was just a harmless prank. Boys will be boys. The cliché hung in the air, stale and hollow. Chief Whitfield turned his gaze to Mrs. Dawson, his eyes unwavering. Harmless, he repeated, the single word laced with incredulity. Dumping a tray of food on another student is not harmless, Mrs. Dawson. It's bullying. It's public humiliation. And in this school, it seems to be tolerated. Darren Dawson shifted in his seat, his face darkening. Now see here, he began, but Chief Whitfield cut him off. Mr. Dawson, he said, his voice still controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of steel, I'm not here to debate the semantics of bullying. I'm here to ensure that it stops. He turned back to Principal Warren. This isn't over. I expect to see real action taken, not just empty promises. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Principal Warren cleared his throat, his gaze darting to Miss Rees, who looked as though she wanted to disappear into the floor. Of course, Chief Whitfield, he stammered. We will address this immediately. Chief Whitfield nodded, his gaze finally shifting to Trent. The boy squirmed under his scrutiny, his bravado completely gone. Trent, Chief Whitfield said, his voice surprisingly gentle, yet the effect was chilling. I understand you have something to say to Jasmine. Trent's eyes flicked to Jasmine, then quickly back to the floor. He mumbled something unintelligible. I didn't hear you, Trent, Chief Whitfield said, his voice still soft, yet the pressure in the room intensified. Trent swallowed hard, his face a mask of shame. I'm sorry, he muttered, the words barely audible. Jasmine stared at him, a complex wave of emotions washing over her. Relief, certainly, but also a strange sense of emptiness. The apology, forced and mumbled though it was, felt hollow. It wouldn't erase the weeks of torment, the constant fear, the public humiliation, but it was a start. a shift in the power dynamic, a crack in Trent's carefully constructed facade of dominance. And for now, that was enough. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this wasn't the end. But it was a beginning of something new, something different. The fear that had been a constant companion for weeks began to recede, replaced by a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The air in Summit Ridge High had shifted. It was a subtle change, a ripple in the stagnant water of routine. The whispers, usually buzzing with Trent Dawson's latest escapade, were hushed, tinged with an unfamiliar caution. Jasmine Whitfield walked through the crowded hallways, the linoleum gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, each step echoing the tremor in her own chest. The looks she received weren't the same as before. The fear, the pity, the averted gazes were gone. In their place, a flicker of something new, something that resembled respect, maybe even admiration. A small, involuntary smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It was a strange feeling, this fragile victory. She'd never imagined that her father, a man of quiet strength and measured words, could cause such a seismic shift in the school's social landscape. The cafeteria buzzed with a nervous energy. The aroma of reheated pizza and stale fries hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. Jasmine could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her as she walked to her usual table, her tray held steady despite the slight tremble in her hands. She wasn't sure what she expected. Apologies? Congratulations? Neither came. Instead, a silence descended, a thick, expectant silence that pressed down on her like a physical weight. It was Liam, one of Trent's usual entourage, who broke the quiet. He offered her a hesitant nod, his eyes wide and uncertain. Kyle and Chase followed suit, their bravado replaced by a strange, almost sheepish awkwardness. Jasmine just nodded back, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could feel the threads of Trent's control unraveling, the fear that had held them captive slowly dissipating. Trent sat alone at his usual table, his friends scattered like leaves in a sudden gust of wind. His usual swagger had vanished, replaced by a rigid stillness. His eyes, usually burning with a self-assured arrogance, were dull, almost vacant. He looked like a dethroned king, surveying the ruins of his lost empire. He hadn't spoken to her, hadn't even looked at her since the incident in the principal's office. The memory of her father's voice, calm yet unwavering, resonated in her ears. He hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened, yet the quiet authority in his tone had silenced the room, including Trent's normally boisterous parents. Darren and Lauren Dawson, usually so quick to defend their son, had shrunk under Chief Whitfield's gaze, their bluster replaced by a stunned silence. He caught her eye across the room. The flicker of defiance that flared in his eyes was quickly extinguished, replaced by a cold, simmering resentment. He rose from his table, his movements deliberate, and approached her. A knot tightened in Jasmine's stomach. Was he going to apologize? Was he going to try to reignite the conflict? Or was this something else entirely? Guess Daddy had to fight your battles for you, huh? His voice was low, laced with a bitter irony that cut through the hushed cafeteria. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusations. Jasmine felt a surge of anger, a hot, burning ember in her chest. She had been dreading this moment, the inevitable counterattack. Yet, now that it was here, a strange sense of calm settled over her. She knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that she wouldn't back down. Not this time. "You're mad," she stated, her voice steady, surprisingly devoid of any tremor. It wasn't a question, but an observation. She met his gaze, refusing to flinch. Inside, a whirlwind of emotions churned, fear battling with newfound courage. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer the dominant force. Trent's jaw clenched, the muscle ticking beneath his skin. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. The confident smirk he usually wore was gone, replaced by a thin, tight line. He was used to fear, used to intimidation, But Jasmine's calm defiance was something he hadn't encountered before. It disarmed him, leaving him momentarily speechless. He had expected tears, apologies, a desperate plea for forgiveness. He hadn't expected this. "You thought you'd get away with it, huh?" Jasmine continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. The whispers around them intensified, the cafeteria holding its breath. "Thought you could just keep pushing, keep hurting people because no one would stop you." Trent's eyes narrowed, the simmering resentment hardening into something colder, something almost brittle. "They pity you," he spat, the words barely a whisper, yet sharp enough to slice through the silence. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim his lost power, to wound her, to bring her back under his control. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "No, Trent," she said, her voice soft, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "They pity you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. The shift in power, once subtle, was now undeniable. Trent stood frozen, the blood draining from his face. He looked around the cafeteria, at the faces watching him, the silent witnesses to his downfall. The pity in their eyes was palpable. It wasn't the pity of a victim, but the pity reserved for someone who had lost everything, someone who had destroyed themselves through their own cruelty. He had built his empire on fear, on intimidation, and now, with that fear gone, there was nothing left but the hollow shell of his former self. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy, the echoes of his retreat reverberating through the silent cafeteria. The silence lingered for a moment longer, then slowly, tentatively, the normal sounds of the cafeteria began to return. The clatter of trays, the murmur of conversations, the squeak of chairs against the linoleum floor. But the air had changed. The oppressive weight that had hung over the school for so long had lifted. Jasmine took a deep breath, the tension slowly easing from her shoulders. The fear hadn't completely vanished, but it was no longer the all-consuming force it had once been. In its place, a new feeling was emerging, a fragile sense of hope, a glimmer of belief that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The hum of the car engine filled the silence, a low, rhythmic thrum against the backdrop of the late afternoon sun. Jasmine watched the houses blur past, each one a fleeting image in the kaleidoscope of her tumultuous day. The vinyl of the car seat was cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the burning shame that had coursed through her just hours before in the crowded, echoing cafeteria. She could still feel the phantom weight of Trent Dawson's gaze, heavy and mocking, as he tipped her lunch tray, sending her carefully packed meal scattering across the linoleum. Pasta, now a sticky, humiliating mess, clung to her shoes. She snuck a glance at her father, Chief Whitfield, behind the wheel. His profile was calm, his hands steady on the steering wheel. He seemed normal, unfazed, but Jasmine knew better. Beneath that composed exterior, she sensed a quiet strength, a carefully controlled restraint that both comforted and unnerved her. She'd seen that look before, during his years as a detective. It was the look of a predator patiently waiting, assessing the prey before making its move. "So," he said, his voice even and calm, breaking the silence, "not bad." Jasmine blinked. Not bad? He'd seen everything. He'd been standing by the cafeteria doors, observing as Trent and his entourage surrounded her, as the taunts escalated, as her tray clattered to the floor. Not bad. Was this some kind of twisted police humor? Her father seemed to sense her confusion. He glanced at her, a flicker of something amusement, understanding, in his eyes. For a first attempt, he added, his lips curving into a small smile. A first attempt? At what? At being humiliated? At becoming the school's newest target? The words caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to cry, to tell him how wrong he was, how terrifying the whole experience had been. But something held her back. A flicker of unease, a prickle of suspicion. There was something in his tone, in the deliberate calmness of his demeanor, that suggested he was playing a deeper game. He continued, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, People like Trent, they only have power if you give it to them. His voice was soft, almost conversational, yet the words resonated with a quiet force. It wasn't a lecture. It was an observation, a statement of fact. Jasmine chewed on her lip, the words swirling in her mind. Give him power? Hadn't she just been stripped of it? Hadn't she stood there, frozen and helpless, as he systematically dismantled her dignity, piece by piece? She looked out the window again, the passing scenery a blur of colors and shapes. Her mind replayed the scene, the taunts, the laughter, the sickening splat of the food. And then the shift, the arrival of her father, the sudden hush that had fallen over the cafeteria. The way Trent had faltered, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her father's unwavering gaze. The expressions on the faces of Trent's friends, Liam, Kyle, chase a mixture of shock and fear. The stunned silence of Mr. Holloway, her English teacher, and the hurried arrival of Miss Rees, the perpetually flustered assistant principal. Even Principal Warren, normally so detached, had looked shaken. A strange feeling began to bubble up inside her. Not quite triumph, not yet relief, but something akin to validation. Her father hadn't rescued her. He hadn't stepped in and fought her battles for her. He'd done something far more powerful. He'd exposed the fragility of Trent's power, the emptiness of his threats. He looked scared. Jasmine murmured, the words barely audible. Her father chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. He should have been. He paused, then added, I didn't intervene right away, Jasmine. I waited. Waited? For what? For her humiliation to be complete? The question formed in her mind, but she didn't voice it. She knew, instinctively, that there was a reason, a strategy behind his actions. I waited for you, he continued, his voice soft yet firm. I waited to see what you would do. A wave of understanding washed over Jasmine. He hadn't been testing her. He'd been observing her, giving her the space to find her own strength, her own voice. He'd known, somehow, that she had it in her. He just needed her to realize it too. I saw the fear in your eyes, he said, but I also saw something else. A spark, a refusal to break. Jasmine closed her eyes, remembering the surge of defiance that had coursed through her as her father had approached, not towards Trent, but towards her. He had knelt beside her, amidst the mess, his gaze unwavering. He hadn't asked if she was okay. He'd simply looked at her, and in that look, she'd seen not pity, but a quiet understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of the battle raging within her. I did it because I knew you weren't weak, he said, his voice a low murmur, filled with a conviction that resonated deep within her soul. And now, everyone else knows it too. The car pulled into their driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel under the tires breaking the spell. Jasmine looked at her father, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. The shame hadn't completely vanished. The sting of the humiliation still lingered, but it was different now. It was overlaid with a nascent sense of power, a burgeoning awareness of her own resilience. She hadn't won the battle, not yet, but she'd found something far more valuable, the strength to fight. She unbuckled her seatbelt, a small, hesitant smile playing on her lips. Not bad, she murmured, echoing his earlier words, but this time infusing them with a newfound meaning. It wasn't just about the events of the day. It was about the realization that she didn't have to shrink to survive. She could stand tall, even amidst the chaos, and find her own worth. The battle had just begun, but for the first time, Jasmine felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of anticipation for what lay ahead.